Hi, I'm Jim Hemphill, features writer for IndieWire, and this is our craft roundtable on visual effects, where technology and creativity come together to expand what's possible in television storytelling. Whether invisible or spectacular, VFX plays a critical role in bringing these worlds to life. Our guests today are, from Stranger Things, Betsy Paterson; from It, Welcome to Derry, Daryl Sawchuk; from Spider-Noir, Hnedel Maximore; from the Boroughs, DeMarco; and from Ted, Hoyt Yeatman. So one of the things that all these shows have in common is the visual effects are just, it goes without saying, they're so integral to the overall design and concept of these shows, whether it's just in terms of building out these worlds or, in the case of Ted, the main character. And so I'm curious for you, what your role is in pre-production.
We're in there very early so that we can really figure out these tough sequences that are really dependent on all of the departments working together and figuring out how to solve a problem. Sometimes you're in even earlier if the directors need help solving, what can we actually do given our budget and given our time frame. So we get in pretty early to help figure all of that out.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty paramount to the success of a given sequence. A lot of us come from a storytelling background, and because you're ultimately going to be putting everything together at the end, like Betsy mentioned, you're having conversations with all of these relevant departments that are doing their part, might not necessarily know how they're all going to come together, but you've got to try to orchestrate that and rally everybody to do all these extra passes that you might be asking for, but that are going to benefit you down the road when you've got to assemble.
Yeah, and as far as the production crews are concerned, VFX is usually some of the early department heads in and some of the last out. By the time we're wrapping and we see other HODs at cast and crew screenings, they've done 3 other shows, and we're finishing up the project.
I agree with you. We are definitely nearly the very first in and almost the very last out.
Always the last out.
Sometimes the last out, particularly for the Boroughs, because we were establishing a new show in a new town in a place that no one had ever seen before. We worked very closely early with production design and our DP to figure out the scope of the town so we could figure out what sets to build where. There was an integral part of pre-visiting the town, which we built in Unreal Engine, so we could sit and look at cameras with the director, the showrunners, the producers, and decide how high do we build that wall to block the thing we don't see so that we can have freedom with the camera in our shoot days. Stranger Things is enormous. The Boroughs is quite contained comparatively, but in that containment, visual effects becomes an advisor to figure out how to shoot where so that we get performances without owing shots. All throughout the series.
Yeah, on Ted, the group has worked together, the crew, over several Ted shows, including the feature. So it's more about getting in there and working with the DP, the lighting, the look, the animation. And what I think is most fun about visual effects is that you really are in at almost the very beginning, even in the storytelling, because they'll look at what needs to be done, or because we had some adventures into Dungeons and Dragons and things like that. And of course, budget plays a big part, so we're always trying to help kind of juggle how we can do it for the budget that they do have, all the way to the very end where you're working with color, and that to me is being as close to the director as one might be, because you really are making the whole thing with all the rest of the crew members. It's really fun. Yeah. It's very exciting.
Speaking of directors, I'm curious how you each find a common language with the director. I'm assuming that some directors probably are very technically oriented and really understand this stuff, and I'm sure that some probably are not. And I'm wondering how you find a way of communicating with directors to understand what they want and sort of make them see what you can do if they're not maybe as technically or visually effects oriented.
I'd say for the most part, everybody was very happy to get involved and we're willing to get on board with us in terms of using, the tools that we had at our disposal to help kind of plan out and craft sequences. But to me, it's all about education and enrolling them in the process. You're not trying to dictate how they shoot their episode, but you're like, hey, here's some ideas. What do you think of this? How about this? And I think building that relationship and that familiarity with the directors and, the DPs on specific episodes is paramount for success.
Same for Spider-Noir. We had a couple of our directors had a lot more VFX experience, and others were comfortable with visual effects. So it was just finding a collaboration, finding a good way to collaborate with them. We did a lot of virtual camera previs, both for shot planning and to help production design set scales. So that was super helpful to get some of our directors in there with the DP and frame up shots in the previs environment and get a stronger understanding of ultimately what the ultimate end goal was.
I think our job is often to listen to those individual directors first, to really hear what they want from the scene, both in the shots and in their freedom of camera movement, because often our role involves reference and props and all kinds of things that can inhibit that work. So we have to start with conversations just to see what's the creative and what's the intent. And then the technical expertise is really up to us. Like, I don't expect any of them to be as in the weeds as I am. So we can either lean in if they want to know all that additional detail, or help them find a path to just understanding what it is they have to shoot so we can do our job later.
On TED, Seth MacFarlane is literally brilliant. He understands visual effects very, very well, and he's an animator. So I would say the show is more like jazz than classical music, meaning that you know the tune, because you know they have the script. Normally there's no boards, right? You just go into the shoot and you kind of know how it's going to ebb and flow, and you just roll with the punches, you know? And since, like I say, the crews work together so much, it just kind of happens silently. He just gets on there. Since he voices it while they're doing it, we don't use almost any technology really on set. There were a couple episodes where we were in like a forest, and in terms of dungeons and things like that, where we had a little bit of previs to kind of work it out, but most of the time it's very organic. And that's what keeps you on your toes, makes it fun, and I think it brings a certain life to the character that you don't find when it's too highly processed. You know, so it's kind of, it's a really interesting project.
I never knew my mother!
You never knew your mother?
No. I never knew my mother. Or any of my aunts.
Oh, Sidney, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. His name was Sidney in the exercise.
Now that is acting.
Well, I'm fascinated by this idea that you, on that show, you don't necessarily have storyboards, or that it's more organic and it's sort of, you know, not as pre-planned. I'm wondering for all of you, like, where the line is, how much do you have to sort of lock yourself into a plan, and how much room is there for you to kind of let things evolve and respond to maybe like what's being discovered on set and what the actors are doing and things like that?
I'm a planner by nature, you know, but I do come from an animation background. So like for me, character performances, designing action sequences, you know, usually you are prevising and kind of working out choreography and, you know, kind of having a template so that you can start with something and use it as a base. And then you're allowed to improvise on set and try out different things. But as long as you've got your the main sequence covered, you know, feel free to improv, you know, as you're going. Andy was an interesting guy. I'd say 75% of what we talked about, we did on the day. The Andy specials, we used to refer to them, were the ones that came up last minute, you know, big surprise to the DP and me, where some of the best shots in the series, you know, and you'd talk to Andy, like, when did you come up with that idea? And he's like, oh, last night, like 3 a.m, I realized we had to come up with something cool to get into the scene. And you're like, oh my God. So, you know, you have to be prepared for both.
The first few weeks of any job, first few months really, are finding that shared language with the showrunner or the director, you know, kind of figuring out what they're interested in, what they want to see, and how to talk to them about it so that they understand that you're trying to, you know, see through their eyes and make sure that you're really speaking the same language and have this, show them that you have the same concerns about the end result. And it also is so different depending on what you're trying to do. You know, if you know that it's just an environment, then really all you can be prepared for is which directions the cameras are going to look. So for things like that, storyboards and previs are not as important. But if you have a fight between a bunch of stunt people and a bunch of CG characters, everyone really wants to know exactly how it's going to go. You know, from the camera to props, to everybody needs to understand the overall ballet of it. But that said, there's still always room for, you know, a B camera's over here doing this that you didn't know about. It's a balance between that.
Yeah.
Daryl, I like that you called it a template. I think a template is a great way of thinking about it, because often we'll go around to the other departments and ask props to have 4 different props standing by for the cast to interact with based on what on the day they find. Like, what is that action? Does it need to have weight? Do we need to feel that it has weight, or are they supposed to throw it really far? Whatever's happening. So that is all the work that happens in the office ahead of time, so that we set a template along with our other HODs, so that we can advise and they have the pieces necessary to capture the performance.
Get down.
You see it, right?
Yes, I see it.
I think it also depends on the technical complexity of your show, right? So like on Spider-Noir, we have a lot of technical timing things that are highly dependent on stunts and special effects all playing well and all the departments playing well together. So I would say we were probably about 80-20 for, 20% you have some leeway to do some pickup stuff and extras, but 80% we have to be super disciplined, shooting what we previs, shooting what we planned for.
Just breathe. Breathe deeply. That's good. 10, 9, 8.
Well, and what were some of your references or influences in terms of like designing just the whole environment and the cityscape and everything? I mean, what were some of the noir movies that you were looking at or thinking about?
Maltese Falcon, Chinatown, Third Man. Our showrunner had a guide, this Bible of what this show ought to be, and every department head took that into production. So our production designer had so many references for us. We lived on Old NYC, which is basically this time capsule for New York that's online, and you can pick a year, go back to a specific time period, and just look through so many photos of what the city looked like. We shot in LA for New York, a lot of set extensions for all of our exterior scenes.
That brings up, you're reminding me that Welcome to Derry and Ted are both essentially also period pieces. And I'm curious what the role of visual effects is in terms of selling the period.
Yeah, for our show, I mean, similar, we had a fantastic production designer. It was set in 1960s Bangor, Maine, which is where Stephen King grew up. And there was a big conversation early on about, what were the practical things that they could do to make the city, look of a time. And, basically everything on the first floor was done. Anything kind of above was something that visual effects would take care of. So a lot of, outrigger signs and, a lot of set pieces to the architecture that would just help kind of enhance the look and the feel.
And on TED, we were mainly on the back lot of Universal and on stages. But there were location shoots that we do out in Boston. And the biggest problem was just getting rid of trees, like palm trees and things like that, right. Always in the way. And so we did a lot of season changes. So we would, be winter and snow, would add those kind of things as well. Driving plates, a lot of driving inside of cars. And so again, arrays would go down streets and stuff like that where you'd have to remove modern day cars or garbage lighting, cans or whatever, so that kind of work was done, to be able to make it look like it was back in 93, back east, that type of thing. So but that's more traditional kind of thing, VFX in terms of doing it.
Stranger Things had a ton of that too for the 80s, and the guys were very, very interested in having the streetlights be, sodium vapor and not the modern LEDs, which made it very difficult because in previous seasons there were some streets left in Atlanta that had sodium vapors, but no longer. So we sometimes the art department would have to dress them in, but of course they would never have enough. And sometimes we were always trying to play with color temperature and trying to get these lights to look like they were period appropriate. Stranger
Things doing, the final season, you're doing the final season of one of the most popular, beloved shows in history. I mean, is there any what kind of pressure do you feel, whether it's self-imposed or from the outside, to you've really got to deliver the goods here?
I mean, I only did the last season. I didn't do the previous ones. And season 4 had been very large, and they were working on it during the pandemic. It was very difficult for everyone involved. I think season 4, it ended up getting bigger than they had thought, so they weren't prepared for some things. So they really wanted to come into season 5 fresh and kind of do a reboot on how they dealt with the visual effects, since they know it was going to be so huge. So we were assuming that it was going to be even bigger than it was, and it ended up being very large, but contained. Like, there weren't a lot of surprises. We knew what we had going in, and they stuck to that pretty well, which was great.
You've got the pressure to deliver on this show, again, that's very beloved, very popular. The Boroughs is like the opposite extreme, where you're starting from scratch, essentially. And I'm curious for you, as you were saying, like, it's such an important part of that show, just the environment, this community, this retirement community where the whole show takes place. And I'm just wondering, like, what were some of the reference points for you or influences in terms of figuring out that look?
The retirement community look of the Boroughs was definitely established in production. We did extension. We did a ton of extension, and we actually looked at Sun City. We watched documentaries about retirees. So we got the vibe of sort of Palm Springs, Florida, and what to look for in those communities. We actually did a field trip out to Palm Springs to check out, like, the golf cart spaced parking and the fun little pathways that are just for retirees that aren't going to use a car. And then taking all of that into a Bible and passing it along to the vendors to help build out a city with those special touches of a little bit of Southwest and a little bit of, like, special Palm Springs beautiful.
And what kind of factors go into deciding what's going to be CG and what's going to be practical? Like, I'm thinking, for example, of something like Vecna on Stranger Things, who I'm assuming is a combination. Like, how do you decide where that line is?
It was almost entirely prosthetic makeup in season 4, but that meant that the actor had to spend 7 or 8 hours in makeup before he could even walk on the set. And both for his comfort and for ease of shooting, since he was going to be in a lot more scenes this season, we decided he would be a lot more CG and just have his face be practical. So he was only had to be in the makeup chair for 2 hours, 3 hours. So that was a big factor. But it was also that, they wanted him to have a little bit more of a glow up, and that he's kind of rebuilt himself between the seasons. So it was a big part of the character as well to kind of build this armature that he's built for himself. And then we were able to have a lot of fun with the movement of it to kind of emphasize his performance and key off of, whatever Jamie, the actor, was doing. We would have all these little vines and veins pulsing according to his kind of mood and the tone of the scene.
For me, the first time really working in horror. So, it's a genre that's heavily steeped in, practical makeup effects and trying to get as much in camera as possible. And for me, too, as a personal philosophy, I think the best visual effects, tend to look if you start with something real and then you're adding into it. If you have to replace, you can replace. But again, having something on hand on the day, I think it gives a better performance. Everybody around, all the crew knows what we're shooting. It just gives you great lighting references, right? Having practical goo and slime and all of this viscera that we had. You're looking at frames that as they're being shot and you're like, oh, wow, that could hold up. Anything we do on top of that is going to look great, because the photography is already a good base. And like you mentioned, having actors in prosthetic makeup, giving you a real performance, giving the director an opportunity to actually, interact and get a performance that he's happy with.
So in the Boroughs, we have a creature that is 7-ish feet tall with 8 limbs that crawls along the ceiling in pressure holds and then, spoiler, feeds on the seniors. So we were not able to do any prosthetics or any kind of in-camera. We did make a bust and we made a full-size puppet. We tried to do some puppeteering, but ultimately the movement is so complex that it became animated. It was the best lighting reference ever.
Yes.
And, all of our actors that had to exist in a scene with this creature are older. It definitely helped them and their performances to see this super creepy bust placed in the super creepy scene. Some of them would wait to see it until right before the shot so that they could react naturally. So I think, again, as much practical as you can, even if you know that you're keeping none of it.
On Ted, there's a lot of physical interaction between Ted, the main character, and the human cast. And so we have this Ted character, we have several stuffies, right? And he's puppeted across the set when we're kind of doing it. That's where everyone kind of talks about and looks at it. And the actors get to work against it. The cameramen get to set their camera moves. Seth reads the lines in real time, and then therefore he can adjust very quickly to the actor or the actor to the performance. Makes it work really well. But there was quite a few times in the different episodes where he's in a bathtub with soap bubbles. He's tussling and being wrapped around and thrown, So that poor little Stuffy goes through a lot. We have some stunt Stuffy. So he looks like he's there. His food plates, all that kind of stuff is very carefully orchestrated.
I think you get a better performance, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
You do, yeah. Because when you come, and some shows, like you say, you really got to nail it down. But what was really kind of fun on this one is it was like jazz. I mean, and I really mean that from a musical standpoint, because you know what the script is, you know what the lines are, but it would change. We would shoot something and say, okay, let's tighten it up, let's do this, let's go over here, and it would just be something where you could make these changes on the set, and the whole thing was very fluid, and everyone, having worked together so much, knew exactly where no words were being passed. It just would happen. Now we have a very confined, kind of limited things that we're doing, but it worked really well, and I think it's really the benefit of the crews that made it happen.
Yeah, I think it's super helpful, but it's all these things that you're doing that people think you're crazy when you're doing them, but you're like, just trust me, give us a year and a half, you're going to see it and think it looks great.
When the shoot starts, you want to have an arsenal of tennis balls, sandbags, just anything to help the actors really feel whatever it is that they need to feel.
Like, it's interesting, something these shows also have in common is they are all, even though they're heavily VFX fantasy-oriented shows, they all are kind of grounded in reality in a weird way. And I'm wondering how that informs the approach that you take.
I think on any show I do, I always try to make the basis of whatever we're working on as practical as possible. Even if I know we're going to be building the whole world and an establisher could be CG, if there's an opportunity to get a drone establisher with the DP directing it, you do it, even if you're replacing every pixel. And especially on a show like Stranger Things, it's so important that everything, even the biggest CG shot, has a real, gritty reality where it starts, because that is the whole point of the show, is how these kind of normal kids deal with this crazy stuff.
And I think some of it is in the notes process, both receiving them from the filmmakers and relaying them. Is that monster walking in tiptoeing?
Yeah.
Is it a threatening stomp? Like, do we hear a sound effect with this? Are they busting through the door, or is it a jump scare? And you don't always look at a scene when you're the artist working on a shot. So it is really important for us to relay, this is a moment of tension. Let the character, even if it's a CG creature, be as tense as all of the actors who are about to do the jump. So that's a huge part of that conversation of tone and communication.
Playing on that, I think a big part of the collaboration comes from the editorial team, and we had a fantastic trio of editors, and again, some had more experience with visual effects type shows than others, and building out tension and tone and all of that. Like you said, we previs things early on. We've got great vendors that'll put a cut together and maybe even have a little bit of sound effects. What I did early on was we would actually pass it over to the picture editors. They would take a pass and actually put some fantastic score and sound design in and allow for the tension of, oh no, this is how long the dialogue's going to seem. This is where I'm going to build a pause before that scare happens. And it transformed the previs that we were able to use and bring to set and kind of go, hey, this is kind of where we're starting with. And everybody would go, oh my God, that's incredible,
We did the same thing. The editors were on from the beginning, and whenever, they would always take a pass at the previs.
Yeah. And on TED, what was kind of interesting is that the editors would edit, and we would work with a blank plate. In other words, you would not see a animatic of TED. And I thought that was really kind of refreshing, because everyone who was in that kind of position of power could visualize what they were seeing. And that saved, I think, a lot of time, and also gave, Seth what he wanted without actually having to try to do an animatic to that level. It was actually just clean plates, and they would make the counts, lock the counts to that empty plate, and then give that to Framestore to do it that way, So that means that you trust the director's vision. He understands what's going on. The editors know, and they're on the same page. Yeah. So it was really kind of interesting.
The hyper planner in me is giving me hives every time I hear about the jazz of tech, because we, going back to our prep and previs, and a lot of our previs stayed in the edits and went to the studio and went to pass studio network cuts for quite a few versions. They were updated, but we stayed true to a lot of the sequences that we planned and previs and shot for. So, yes, there were some shots that the full VFX shots evolved and changed from previs through the cut. But a lot of the stuff that we planned for that had live action stayed, and you had to be dogmatic about it because otherwise you lose you blow your budget, or you lose the tone of the show. And
I know it's very different. Yeah, but see, we're working with an animator too. That's the other thing. And Seth is an animator, so he visualizes it perfectly, and you can see what's going on. He'll even say, "You clipped his head to the camera operator," because and there's nothing in the plate, right? Oh, okay, and they'll go back and they'll do it again, So he sees a really strong vision, and so that makes it really fun when you're working on these kind of projects because it's going to be right when it goes on there because he sees it. You don't have to convince him. He knows when it's working on an empty plate. He'll tell you whether it's right.
Rare.
Yes.
Wild.
It is very rare, right? But that was fun. Made it really fun, right?
It does speak a little bit to the challenges that you sometimes have. You're towing the line of you're the person that's dogmatic. You have to have a structure and this is what we need bare minimum to make the shots achievable. But you also have a whole team of people that you're trying to not slow down the AD. They need to make their day, and sometimes you do have to let things go and become a little bit more improvisational.
There's a lot of bargaining on set.
Yes,
for sure. That's it's interesting. You're kind of constantly those two lines of being the planner and the organizer, but also having to kind of work and improvise on the day.
Well, this has been great. Thank you all so much for coming here
Jim.
and talking with me about this stuff. It's really fascinating. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Thank you guys.